word, excuse me, for an opportunity to come together as a congregation. We ask for your blessings both upon our study and for all those people who are not feeling well right now. Give them your hand of healing. Give them the hand of the confidence to know that you are with them, that you are taking care of all people and all things. In your name we pray. Amen. All right, so Luke chapter 1. We're going to start at verse 57, the birth of John the Baptist. Now the time came for Elizabeth to give birth, and she bore a son. And her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had shown great mercy to her. And they rejoiced with her. And on the 8th day they came to circumcise the child, and they would have called him Zechariah after his father. But his mother answered, "No, he shall be called John." And they said to her, "None of your relatives is called by this name." And they made signs to his father, inquiring what he wanted him to be called. And he asked for a writing tablet, and wrote, "His name is John." And they all wondered. And immediately his mouth was opened, and his tongue loosed. And he spoke, blessing God. And fear came to all their neighbors, and all these signs were talked about through all the hill country of Judea. And all who heard them laid them up in their hearts, saying, "What then will this child be? The hand of the Lord was with him." All right. So in this reading, I suppose we could call it part of the birth narrative of, not of John necessarily, but of Jesus, even though this was describing John's birth. We have a continuation leading up to Luke chapter 2 when Jesus is born. As you may recall, John the Baptist is the forerunner of Jesus. He's going to be out kind of kind of a crude set of imagery, perhaps, is you've all driven on the highway or the road, and you see a car coming that says wide load, and then there's a big truck with a wide load coming, and there's, depending on the size of the load, I suppose, is another car warning people or proclaiming to people coming up on them that ahead of them is a wide load. And so John the Baptist, who we're reading about right here, is perhaps going to be foretelling, telling people, warning them, getting them ready, preparing them for Jesus to come. Now, as all analogies do, they break apart very soon, and so my analogy just broke apart because there's nothing behind Jesus foretelling or warning people coming up on Jesus, unless you want to talk about other parts of the scriptures doing that type of a thing. But in this small reading, it's only a few verses really, from verse 57 to verse 66, we have kind of the structures kind of broken down into parts, where the first two verses will talk about John's parents and everybody else's reactions. And then the third verse will talk about John. And then it'll go on to another three-verse section, where the first two verses are going to be talking about John's parents and everyone else, and the third verse about John. And then there's a third and final of this short reading, where it's the two verses about parents and everyone else, and the third verse about John. So we kind of get kind of this miniature diagram, miniature chart, breakdown in this reading that talks about ultimately talks about John and everything, but kind of breaks it down for us a little bit. So the first section here, beginning at verse 57, now the time came for Elizabeth to give birth, and she bore a son. So very matter of fact, very descriptive. Elizabeth is having a baby. And her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had shown great mercy to her, and they rejoiced with her. Very common thought process, isn't it? That if somebody's going to have a baby, everybody gets happy and excited, right? And, you know, a new little one is very exciting. Even more so, perhaps, the wonderment is for Elizabeth, who in a previous section was described to be beyond the years of childbearing. In other essence, she was too old, in most people's opinion, to have a child. And so sometimes I find myself just stopping and wondering, what is their reactions? I mean, we got the in-print reaction, but what do you think people were thinking and feeling? First, at the announcement that Elizabeth was going to have a baby at however old she was beyond childbearing years. And then when she actually has the baby. What do you think? If you were Elizabeth, what kind of reactions and emotions and whatever do you think you would be getting? Now, I realize it's kind of hard for us guys to put our shoes in Elizabeth's shoes, but we can do that with Zechariah. Do what, Mark? Yeah. Front page stuff. Yeah. Indeed. So, whether good or bad or easy to believe or hard to believe, everybody's talking about it. Yeah. Well, it's, you know, in today, we have all these pregnancy tests and positives and false positives, and, you know, I think a lot of couples will wait X number of days or weeks just to make sure, or they want to tell somebody first, or whatever their example is, they wait. Here, I wonder, it's a little bit different because their pregnancy test isn't something they picked up at Walgreens for X number of dollars, but rather it's mom and dad, it's the angel, it's Zechariah coming out of the Holy of Holies. In essence, it's God. So that perhaps leads us, one, on the surface value, to talk about this idea of trusting God in this scenario. And two, as this topic broadens out to perhaps include the rest of our conversations, it might not necessarily be about having a baby at a time when most women don't have babies. And we're not necessarily talking about God suddenly appearing right there and saying, hey, guess what you're going to do? Although God can do that if he wants to, I suppose. But in your own way of life, when you have an important decision to make, to announce, to whatever, is it easy or hard to follow through with it? To act on it, to push the button? What do you think? It's harder? Okay? Yeah. And very much so. Other thoughts? All right. So, okay. Oh, yeah. Well, and that's a concept that perhaps we missed a little bit, is that it's not like she has 4 or 5 other children that run around out there at this point in time, probably have their own children. But this is her first. And granted, again, this is more from a guy/father's perspective. But for a woman having their first child, even in normal childbearing years, that's a whole new level of what? Ladies, you describe it. Apprehension, okay? Life-changing, certainly. Got to imagine a certain amount of fear. Yeah. Or just the basic common thing of, I'm not old enough yet to have a baby. Is I got to imagine a big one. And then when you start playing that game of, well, in 20 years, when they're 20, that adds 20 years to my life. And then you start thinking about your own mortality. And at some point, I suppose, I don't know, does thinking about mortality and stuff go from apprehension and fear to, hey, I actually kind of like this. That means I don't have to, or, sooner I get to be with God. And the idea of watching grandchildren and instead of your own children. I mean, they're all moments of transition, all moments of excitement. But I have to imagine, I'm not at the point yet of watching grandchildren yet, but it's probably within the next 5 to 10 years, I suppose. When I say comments like that, or when Allison teases the girls about that, they're all like, no, I'm not old enough for that yet. So, but yes, whatever moment of life and transition that one finds themselves at, it's you can play both sides of the coin. Be fearful and apprehensive to great joy and excitement. So the first 2 verses were pretty self-explanatory, just basically giving thoughts. Okay, and they rejoiced with her. Verse 59, and on the 8th day they came to circumcise the child, and they would have called him Zechariah after his father. So the idea that they were going to circumcise him, it's, kind of just one of those things, but it also plays a bigger role in the whole salvation narrative, perhaps, is that God sends his Son to earth to ultimately go to the cross and die and rise again on the 3rd day, right? That's something we've studied for probably all our lives. That's something we've believed for all our lives. That's something that has been the foundation of our faith all our lives. This idea that he was circumcised would have been kind of we might use the phrase rite of passage. We might use the phrase that places him in the family of Israel, the chosen people. But it also goes to show that Jesus places himself, now that we're talking about John versus Jesus, but the idea that Jesus will eventually be circumcised on the 8th day, that places Jesus under the law so that he can eventually, through Easter, fulfill the law. Not abolish it, but fulfill the law. And so John being circumcised was one of those things that they do, but it also gives John the ability to say he's a member of the chosen race, right? That John is preparing the way for Jesus. This idea of the 8th day is kind of an interesting thought. That there's the commentaries go into this big, long history of it that would have been rather boring to think through. But the idea that Jesus was circumcised on the 8th day, on the 8th day. That day after, the 8th day is usually considered that day after Easter Day, Easter Sunday, when Jesus rose, and there were nothing further to do for salvation after Jesus rose, unless you want to talk about ascension and all that kind of a thing. But so, did you see the pattern though in these first section of 3 verses? That verse 57 and 58 talk about John's parents and relatives and anybody else, and then verse 59 talked about John himself. Okay? So in verse 60, but his mother answered, "No, he shall be called John." And so this whole idea of naming him was a big thing as well. And I wonder if it was a little bit of a stronger tradition. I mean, that tradition is still carried on till today, that a baby is called for a family member. You often hear of a name, and that more than likely turns out to be a grandfather's name or middle name, or father's name or middle name, and so forth. And kind of a fun story, at least I think it's fun, because it concerned me in a sense. But for each of the girls, we're going to potentially use the name Mark as maybe a middle name. But then the baby always came out as a girl. So it never worked to use Mark and so forth. But for Elizabeth and Zechariah, you remember Zechariah at this point still can't talk. But family names, everybody assumed that this little one was going to be named Zechariah for dad and so forth. And so I guess we'd have Zechariah Jr. in a sense. My college roommate his name was George, but he was George III. And you all understand George was grandpa and George II was dad, and George III was my roommate. And I once asked him if he enjoyed that, and he said no. Because if you ever want to try to get your mail, don't be called a second, third, junior, whatever. He was constantly getting grandpa's mail and constantly getting dad's mail, and you can figure out all the combinations. Grandpa's getting grandson's mail, and so that was just a headache and a half, according to my roommate. So do we have any seconds or thirds or juniors in here? So, so at this time, everybody's thinking that this little one's going to be named Zechariah and so forth. But Elizabeth says, nope, his name's going to be John. And it's interesting. I wonder if this would happen to today. So you'll have to give your opinion on this. But everybody said, oh, okay, well, that's nice. Zechariah, what's your opinion? This idea that they kind of assumed a formality, and they assumed that Elizabeth would agree with them, excuse me, and so forth. And assumptions are always I mean, they're easy to make, and we make a lot of them, but that doesn't necessarily mean the outcome that it is going to suggest. It maybe suggests what you think is a high probability of outcome, but it's not 100% probability. So they skip to Dad, and knowing that Dad can't speak, they know that he can write, and so as being a scribe, it probably makes a lot of sense for him to say, give me a piece of paper and I'll write it down and give you my answer that way. But how does that strike you? Especially you ladies. Nancy. I like it. Good. Good. Why are they making signs when he's not deaf? Indeed. You know, that thought kind of not related at all, but why do you park on a driveway and drive on a parkway? I haven't figured that one out yet. But yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I bet. You know, and probably was on the woman's mind constantly. Yes. So, appealing to Dad in a sense, do you think that, what do you think? Did they really think that that was going to get them their answer they wanted? Yeah. Right? Yeah. Ah, yeah, indeed. Yeah. John, well, indeed. Yeah. Yeah, right? So indeed, so we got the whole gossip factor of, if John comes out looking like the mailman instead of Dad. Yeah. Yeah. He probably didn't have a gel pen, right? Yeah. Yeah, he probably could have. I'm sure he communicated somehow. And as a husband and wife know each other, I'm sure, they know what kind of mood the other is in, and without needing words. And until you finally and ultimately get to that point where even looking across the room, you can tell what kind of mood your spouse is in. Yeah. Well, I mean, Zachariah can't speak, so, but then again, he can write, and huh? Well, and there's always that thing too. At this time, literacy is not exactly running top of the charts here.
got something out. So in this whole time that he wasn't able to speak, then you know he's got to be frustrated. He's probably busy his voice. We have all these people who probably are not thrilled with having to talk to his wife all the time.
Yep.
And then now you get to the end, and then she throws out this off the wall non-tradition, like, oh, little woman, you don't know what you're talking about, so we are going to go back to him. And then it's like, yeah, no, she's right. I just think back, who he is. It's not like he just sat there for all these months and didn't do anything.
Yeah.
He still had to take care of people, had a job.
Yep.
He had to have somebody to help her so that she had to have been doing a lot of communicating. Think about it. You sit there with your spouse and like, I guess. You don't finish your sentence. So this probably helped communicate some and then have their version. Some of these people not. Like, I really don't want to talk to you. I want to talk to you.
Yeah.
Not who you
And if there was ever anything confidential that had to be talked about, that, Allison, we love you dearly, but we need to talk to Pastor Mark confidentially. But I needed Allison to communicate or something. And so, yeah, there's elements there that, when you really start to think about this, man, that must have made it really difficult. And then this whole idea of, moving from Zechariah, I don't know if this necessarily can explain it, but it starts to show a shift per se. I think of this every Wednesday afternoon when the confirmation kids are doing their reciting through the books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, so on and so forth, that you have these Old Testament names that are, well, Old Testament names. We all know if we say Old Testament names, we all have a certain concept that goes through your mind, what that is. And then all of a sudden, you get done, they finally get to Malachi, and then we switch to the New Testament, and we have names like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so there seems to be a shift from Old Testament names to New Testament names, from Zechariah to John. And then ultimately here in the next chapter, Jesus, which is perhaps a name that, us North European descendants probably don't use that name a whole lot. My understanding is that there are cultures that do use the name Jesus, maybe pronounce it Jesus or something similar to that. But I think it continues to show that shift from Old Testament names to New Testament names. John, probably. I mean, I'll look that up here and get back to you, but my guess is it's just John. And it would have been in the Greek at this time, but for Jesus, the Old Testament name would have been Yeshua, which would have been very similar, is the name for Joshua, the book of Joshua. And so Joshua is oftentimes called a forerunner or typology is a lot of times what they say for Jesus, a type of Jesus in a sense, where Joshua was seen as a savior leading the children of Israel into the promised land. Moses was that oftentimes. Any of the Elijah, a lot of those Old Testament personalities was seen as a type of Christ, but not the Christ ultimately. So now in Greek, the Johannan would be kind of that name for John. But that's interesting. I'll have to look it up and see if John appears in or is got a Hebrew equivalent. So John is more than likely the English equivalent of that name. So anybody else have any know if there's anything more specific about that? No? Okay, let me do some research on that and I'll get back to you next week and so forth. So this idea that name, he shall be called John. And then in verse 61, and they said to her, none of your relatives is called by this name. 62, and they made signs to his father, inquiring what he wanted him to be called. And he asked for a writing tablet and wrote, his name is John. And they all wondered. When they use this word wondered and / pondered, they kind of held it close to them. They got them thinking. It got them remembering all of this. I think of the next chapter with Mary. After she's observing the shepherds coming and doing their thing, eventually the wise men, in modern society we love to include the wise men in the nativity, right? But the wise men don't come for a number of weeks later, and so forth. So, all right, the name is the English form of Johannes, which are the Latin forms of the Greek name Johannes, originally borne by Hellenized Jews, transliterating the Hebrew name, there we go, more of a Yochanan. The contracted from form of the longer name, and another big long Hebrew name. Old Testament name, right? Meaning Yahweh is gracious, the Lord is gracious, or Yahweh is merciful. There are numerous forms of the name in different languages. These were formerly often simply translated as John in English. That's according to Dr. Google. So, which is always a fun place to start getting the curious juices started, and so forth. So thank you for sending that to me. All right, so in this next section, it's going to focus more on Zechariah here. And he asked for a writing tablet and wrote, his name is John. And they all wondered. And immediately his mouth was opened and his tongue loosed. Now, before we read the last part of that sentence, which technically we already read, but before we read that last part of the sentence, if you couldn't speak for X number of days, months even, what would be the first thing out of your mouth when you can speak again? Praising God, okay? That's certainly what Zechariah is going to do here. Praise God. Other thoughts? All right. Pardon? Thirsty, okay. I want a beer. I want a cheeseburger. All right. And he spoke, blessing God. Now, the next section, which we'll study next Sunday. Oh my goodness. Where does the time go? All right. With that thought in mind, excuse me. Next Sunday, we'll be down in this next section here, Zechariah's prophecy, starting at verse 67, and so forth. But I want to get through the last couple of sentences here. Fear came on all their neighbors, and all these things were talked about through all the hill country. And all who heard them laid them up in their hearts, saying, what then will this child be? For the hand of the Lord was with him. The idea that the people got to witness Zechariah coming out of the Holy of Holies and not being able to speak, they're having a baby when they're past childbearing years, the fact that they actually had this baby, because there's got to have been a certain amount of people saying, yeah, right. Maybe 30 years ago, I'm sorry, ma'am, but you're past that time. This isn't going to happen. If you need a baby fix, come on over to my house. I'll invite my granddaughter over and all that kind of a thing, and you can hold them. But now they get to see that this actually happens. And this wonderment is praising God. Zechariah gets to speak again, and he's praising God. Not only can he speak, but also he's got a baby boy, right? And then everybody else is praising God because they just got to witness this miracle and have now start the next stage of wonderment, that God is with them. There you go. Excellent. John, granted, John right at this point is still yay big, and so he's got the baby factor going. But eventually he's going to be yay big, and he's going to be out in the wilderness wearing camel's hair and eating locusts and other such fun things that normal people do. And he's going to have all eyes on him, which we'll potentially get to at some point. But this idea that the presence of God is with them has got to be an incredible feeling to have, because in chapter 2, God literally will be with them. Second person of the Trinity, Jesus Christ, which when we get to that on Christmas Day, we'll have all kinds of thoughts about and wonderment about what does this mean, as Luther would say. Final thoughts, questions? All right, let us close with the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art Thanks for coming.